Welcome to Baltic Ways. I'm your host, Ben Gardner-Gill. On June 14, 1941, the Soviet Union deported more than 10,000 people from Estonia to Siberia. 8 years later, they deported 20,000 more. These deportations have left a lasting legacy on Estonian society, though the majority of the population today was not alive to experience them. Decades later, behind the Iron Curtain, those in northern Estonia got a peek of freedom and the West through Finnish TV. In this episode of Baltic Ways, we examine how historical experiences impact political views and participation. Joining me are two AABS grantees. Isabel DeSisto is a PhD candidate in politics at Princeton University. She studies comparative politics with a regional focus on Eastern Europe. Her dissertation examines the long-term effects of Soviet-era repression on contemporary political behavior in the region. She received the AABS dissertation grant in 2025. Robert Lipinski is a doctoral student of politics at Oxford University, writing a dissertation on the role of Finnish TV in pushing Soviet-occupied Estonia towards independence and democracy. He uses quantitative methods to study historical political economy. Robert is a 2024 awardee of the AABS dissertation grant. Isabel, Robert, welcome to Baltic Ways.
Thanks for having us.
Hello, it's great to be here.
Well, I would like to start with both of you. Neither of you are natives to the Baltic states, and neither am I, and so I always like to ask my guests who are in this same position, how did you get interested in this field? Isabel, we'll start with you.
Thanks for that question. I'd heard about Estonia in particular, which is the country I have the most familiarity with, growing back to childhood, because one of my mother's childhood friends from her small town in Massachusetts grew up, well, he was Estonian, of Estonian heritage, and during the Cold War, he was participating in lots of Estonian diaspora organizations, and so my mom told me stories from her childhood. She would mention this guy. I ended up going myself just on holiday, basically. In 2022, in the summer, I ended up doing a little bit of a tour. I was already in Eastern Europe. And during my PhD, started to study the long-term effects of Soviet violence in the region. As we'll come to, I got into that study in Moldova, where I was an exchange student, and I was thinking about how to broaden the scope. And I'm sure as your listeners will be aware, and we'll talk about more later, the Baltics are sort of a natural next place to go. So it was originally as a tourist, but then kind of transitioned to an academic interest.
Fantastic. And Robert, how about you?
Well, for a long time, I sort of admired Estonia as this leader, especially in the digital fields, the founder country of Skype and many other applications. But actually, the first closer involvement came from a work project when I was a research assistant in the World Bank. I was simply assigned to work on local development dashboard in Estonia. And then I got completely in love with the country. So when I first visited, I spoke with some partners and friends that we had there, and I learned that many of them can understand Finnish language. So I asked about them out of just curiosity. I knew the languages were similar and so on. And they told me that in the childhood, they watched Finnish TV, which was available in Estonia. And it was a thought, a sentence that really stuck with me. And I turned it into my first PhD topic. And then it got off from there. Now I'm also studying the impact of the Baltic Way demonstration, and I'm completely, in love and very intrigued by the country, not only Estonia, but Latvia and Lithuania as well.
Wonderful, wonderful. I think we have similar experiences, as do many others, where you sort of happen upon it almost by chance in some cases, and then you fall in love with the place a little bit. From a very cheery point to a not so cheery point, Isabel, we're going to move to your research. So what is the sort of historical crux of what you are studying, and then how did you get to your topic where you are now at the late stage of your PhD?
I came to this topic, again, a sort of idiosyncratic method. I was an exchange student right before college in Moldova, in Chisinau, the capital. And after I started my PhD, I returned to Moldova many years later. And they were, at that time that I was there, just sort of by happenstance, having a big commemoration for the anniversary of the 1949 mass deportations. As your listeners will probably know, after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between the Nazis and Stalinist Soviet Union, the Soviet Union essentially laid claim to what became the western part of the Soviet Empire, which included the Baltic countries, but also included lesser-known Moldova, then Bessarabia, which is a Romanian province. There were several waves of deportations, the largest of which was in 1949, when the Soviets rounded up so-called kulaks, who were wealthy peasants. I mean, this was anything from people who had quite a bit of land to people who had, a mill or slightly more than their neighbors. I happened upon the commemoration of these tragic events in Moldova, and this was also in the context of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine. And so I became very interested in understanding the long-term consequences of these repressions, which influenced the lives of so many people in this region, both in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, also Moldova, Western Ukraine, and understanding not only how these experiences affected people across generations, but also how these experiences have affected people in the context of the war, where I think a lot of these historical experiences have become really salient once more, seeing what's happening in Ukraine.
I think we've seen that a lot in scholarship that Baltic Studies academics have produced in the last few years, and it's becoming even more clear now that we are 4 years in since the full-scale invasion. So we're going to come back to that in just a second. Robert, your sort of story and your study starts a little bit later in the time frame, once Estonia has been occupied by the Soviet Union and is sort of looking out. How did Estonia come to receive these Finnish TV channels? How did this come to be a cultural phenomenon in the way that it was?
Right. Thank you for that question. So, as you say, my study starts in the 1970s, effectively, where the Finns built a TV mast in Espoo near Helsinki. They built in 1971, and it's powerful enough to reach roughly 1/3 of northern Estonia. There was some weaker TV mast already in the 1960s, but it was strong enough only to reach very northern shores of Estonia. So effectively, very few people could watch it. Whereas the mast built in 1971, for all the purposes, according to all the sources that I could find, it wasn't built to broadcast any signal to Estonia. It was just built for internal Finnish consumption so that people in the northern parts of Finland could watch better TV, but obviously signal goes in all directions. So it happens that 1/3 of Estonia, obviously Tallinn and Harju County, but all places up to Haapsalu, Rapla, Järva, and even Agopera in the east could receive Finnish TV, at least when the weather was good enough. So this created this unique setup where Estonia was still part of the Soviet Union with all the limitations on free expression, on free media, on elections. The media that was available nationally was only, national channels that were controlled by the propaganda department of the party. So everything was strictly controlled. The information that could be transmitted on the news, the type of entertainment that was available to Estonians, that was strictly controlled. There was also Russian TV from then Leningrad, severely limited. But then it was sort of like a window to the West opened, at least for those people who lived in Northern Estonia. They could suddenly watch not only Finnish shows and news, they could also watch many American shows, TV series Dallas, the Olympics in Los Angeles, the movie Emmanuel, and there were many, many instances where the content available on Finnish TV was completely different to what people could watch on the on national TV channels. So what I got interested in is whether that had any effect on how people perceived their place in the world, the occupation effectively by the Soviet Union, and the desirability for independence and liberal capitalist Estonia. So that's what I seek to study. And the setup is also unique in the sense that it allows us to differentiate between causal effects and correlations. So if it was the whole Estonia that could watch Finnish TV, then it would be really difficult to tell apart its effects because effectively every Estonian would have the same chance to watch it. But what happened is that it was only 1/3 of the country, roughly half of the population, that was able to see it. So especially on the margins, so those borderline counties, municipalities, where the signal was just strong enough to be available and just weak enough not to be, they're heavily compared. And we can add many controls to our models about population, ethnic composition, and so on to ensure that they are really comparable. So we have a setup like in an experiment during a medical trial where the treatment group, which in this case, people who can watch Finnish TV, and the control people who only have access to national media. And then when you compare the outcomes, we look at political attitudes already after the independence, we look at the electoral results and see whether there is any difference.
And if I can just jump in here, while I was doing interviews for my research on the long-term impacts of deportations on political attitudes, this actually came up quite often. I was familiar with Robert's research and had read his excellent paper that I hope will be published in a great place very soon. We would have these interviews. I would sit down with these old ladies and younger people, and we would have tea, and they would sort of tell me about their lives. And it came up just in the course of our conversations. People would say, well, we had access to TV and from Finland, and that allowed us to see things from a different perspective or outside. And it was funny, people would even tell me that those who didn't have access to Finnish TV would often congregate in the house of relatives or friends who did. And I even went to a music festival in Narva, border town between Russia and on the Estonian side, and they had a Finnish musician, and it seemed like quite a lot of the audience could understand everything. And she even asked at one point, how many of you raise your hands if you speak Finnish? And loads of people did. And so I thought to myself, I was like, geez, Robert is really onto something.
Absolutely. And Isabel, I mean, you've led us right to the place where I want to dig in a little bit deeper here, which is the reason why I've brought both of you together in this way, though you also found each other during fieldwork in Estonia, is because we're talking about the modern ramifications of historical events, to put it in a very broad brushstroke on there. So as we've come to these interviews now, Isabel, that you were conducting in Estonia, I've read some of your work. People would bring up the full-scale invasion of Ukraine out of nowhere, essentially. You wouldn't be talking about it, and they would bring it up. It was a very salient thing. Could you talk a little bit about the texture that those interviews and having that qualitative data brought to your research?
For me, it's always been important to marry the quantitative and the qualitative, in part because I think for some of these tough historical questions, you often have a limit to what data can do. In Robert's case, he described really nicely this sort of neat, what they call natural experiment, where half of the country or certain portion was exposed and part was not. But in the case of many historical events whose consequences we want to study, you don't always have such a clean setup. And so to really understand the kind of texture of what was going on, there was no such thing as random assignment in terms of these repressions. And it was really important for me to understand on a human level, how did this influence people? And so part of it is the methodological troubles that I faced that necessitated qualitative research in addition to quantitative research. But part of it is that the surveys, really as great as they were that we did together, which was a great collaboration, they left a lot of holes in terms of how were stories transmitted across generations. For my own work, I'm interested in how experiences of violence affect people's politics, not just the victims themselves, but subsequent generations who might have heard stories from their grandparents and things like that. And so it was really important for me to chat to people, and I was amazed and very grateful to have such open and willing participants. But one thing I didn't expect as I was trying to understand the consequences of these deportations and other types of violence for politics, I didn't expect to hear Ukraine so frequently. Perhaps I should have, but I think if I had done this study at a different time in 2021, or perhaps longer when the war, I hope, will be over, I would have a different experience as a researcher, because many people in Estonia, in all the Baltic countries indeed, really saw history repeating itself. They not only were very afraid for themselves as countries that border Russia, but also many of my interviewees would say things to me like, I'm remembering my grandfather's story about being deported as I watch Ukrainian children being deported. I'm remembering stories of having my language suppressed as I'm watching in occupied territories, Ukrainians being forced to go to school in Russian and being forced to listen to the Russian anthem and sing it and do military drills. And so many people sort of felt like this terrifying deja vu. And I think, at least in Estonia, and I'm sure in Latvia and Lithuania as well, these experiences under Soviet occupation helped people to empathize with what Ukrainians are going through. And I think it's no surprise that the level per capita of aid to Ukraine has been so high in all of the Baltic nations. Of course, part of that is fear for their own safety, but I think part of it is these historical experiences that have allowed people to really feel for Ukrainians.
I can absolutely see that. I think there's been a lot of research done and there's been a lot of findings that just show how visceral this has been for citizens of the Baltic states. This deja vu feeling, as you say, even that's passed intergenerationally. Robert, to your extent, with the research you've done, there are still plenty of voters alive today who watched Finnish TV during the mid 20th century. But then there's also some second order effects. There are children now who are part of the voting public, in some cases, pretty large portion of the voting public who were born too late to remember that. So could you talk a little bit, Robert, first about the impact of your research, some of those findings, and then get a little bit into that hint we got from Isabel there about this work that the two of you conducted together, this survey?
When it comes to the survey that we conducted together, the fact that we were doing that over 30 years after the events in question, that was a limiting factor. So we designed it in a way that would try to capture any intergenerational transmission mechanisms. So for people who were either born after the Cold War or effectively too young to remember any of it, instead of, in my case, asking about Finnish TV watching, obviously they couldn't, we asked whether your parents watched and whether they lived in a place that received signals strong enough. And then we looked at whether the fact that your parents watch it have any causal effect on political attitudes towards many modern day issues, including support for the Ukraine. The effects are a bit smaller, but we do find some measures of support and negative feelings towards what Russia is doing, what Russia has become nowadays, as well as more measures like the recent 2025 referendum to effectively ban non-citizens from voting in the Estonian local elections, sort of as a security measure. So we do some effects on that, even for children, people who watch the TV, like the watchers themselves.
So we have this joint project coming together, which matches both of your research because we're talking about many generations down the line. If both of you could talk a little bit, and we'll start with Isabel here, on the end conclusions you've come to in terms of looking at what this does for Estonian politics today, how each of your respective areas of interest in your studies affect. So, Isabel, we'll start with you.
Yeah, we were very fortunate. I just wanted to shout out to have support from the American Political Science Association. And I've had support from, of course, AABS and the Estonian government as well. So just wanted to thank them and our colleagues, Francis Caton and Hannah Foltz, who helped us put together this survey. So we're not at the time, maybe we will in the future, writing any papers together. But the really cool thing is that we were able to field this survey jointly. So we, and as well as Francis, could all pool our resources and ask different questions that we were all interested in, which is really important because survey work, for those who haven't done it, can be really expensive, especially in highly developed countries where you end up paying more to survey companies. I was worried about the price of being able to do it on my own, and it ended up being that, as you can hear, Robert and I have a lot of overlap, so our questions fit quite well together. But anyway, to answer your real question, I think that the deportations and Soviet repressions, while they happened so far in the past, and as you rightly say, Ben, they're not in living memory for many people, they're very much still alive in memories that are passed down across generations. This is something that was super interesting for me to learn about, or these kind of mechanisms for many people. It was dangerous to talk about these topics during the Soviet period, and a lot of my interviewees, less so in Estonia, but certainly in Moldova and Kazakhstan, where I also did interviews, people were afraid of talking about this. They didn't want to put a black mark on their children, and indeed, they suffered a lot of discrimination during the Soviet period, and not only in the Stalinist period, but also after. There were restrictions on former deportees who came back. There were restrictions on where they could live. Many could not live in major cities, which had its own possible economic effects going forward. Many were barred from certain careers and certain types of education. And so this was in addition to the trauma that their families experienced. And I think that this has had really important and strong lasting effects. Now, talking about cause versus correlation is a really tough, like I said, because you don't have any kind of experimental treatments. But I can say that in terms of correlational relationships, we definitely see in the data that whose family members experience these types of repressions. One of the top line findings of my research is that these people are very highly politically active, more so than those whose family members did not experience repression. One of the big challenges and hopes of my dissertation research is to convince my readers that this is cause and effect. So part of it, I think, is somewhat surprising. You might expect repression in the long-term violence is supposed to demobilize people. That was why the Soviets did these things, is because they were trying to eliminate potential opposition from whether it be interwar political elites and politically active people who were deported or people who were materially well off. They were trying to neutralize these people. And at least in the long term, what I'm finding is they failed. These people are highly active participants in politics today, at least on average. And not only that, but in terms of attitudes, not only did people whose family members experienced violence tend to vote more, tend to protest more in favor of issues they care about, but they also tend to be much more anti-Russia. No surprises there. And in addition, more pro-Ukrainian. And so what I'm finding is not only is there sort of a magnitude thing, where at least in the long term among subsequent generations, violence has this mobilizing effect, but it's also in certain directions. And the most clear and salient direction is an anti-Russia direction.
Which I think is on its face unsurprising. But the fact that you've been able to track the prospective causal relationship, we'll say, from A to B through the generations is really fascinating. It's not just something that we would assume to be, oh, yeah, that's probably the case. But no, we can actually have the data to show it. Robert, to you, pretty much the same question, just in terms of the top line conclusions of your research. And then I've got a question for both of you after that.
Great. Thank you, Ben. And I just need to say that the work that Isabel has been doing in Estonia, but also in Moldova, in other countries, is really impressive mix of professionalism and compassionate approach to this very difficult topics. When it comes to the top line conclusions and the ramifications of the research, I trust that the brunt of the effects of Finnish TV was already felt during the singing revolution and then the transition period, as well in the post-transformation years, that probably was more affected by Finnish TV than the modern day political attitudes. A lot has happened since then. So a lot of other events have had an influence on how Estonians think. Many people moved either away from Estonia or between places that were treated with Finnish TV and not treated. And obviously people, they interact, so they also transmit the violence. So many of the effects we probably no longer observe. If we were to field similar survey like in the 1990s, we would probably see much stronger effects. Nevertheless, we do see effects of larger turnout in national parliamentary elections in the 90s, but they tend to fade away by early 2000s. But that's fully expected. If one looks at the vast literature coming from the East Germany, where it was the West German TV that was transmitting Western values and influenced East Germans, there are many effects along multiple margins. But mainly in the 1990s, by the 21st century, most of those dissipate. One more resource that I can recommend for people that are interested in how Finnish TV changed perspective, in this case of Estonian elites during the transition years, is a piece by Kevin Axe, a researcher that I met in one of AABS conferences. And she wrote a master thesis interviewing several of the transition leaders, both post-communist leaders and independent movement activists, who said that watching Finnish TV for them and also for the Estonian population really set the course that it was the liberal capitalist direction in which the economy needs to be transformed, however painful it might be. And many of them stuck to this course despite the difficulties, because they watch Finnish TV and they learn that this is the economic system that gives people the greatest opportunities, especially compared to Central economy. One more thought that I might have about the importance of such research into the future, not past, not present, but the future, is that we are currently seeing spread of reverse cases of authoritarian countries, authoritarian media that are transmitting increasingly their propaganda and their messages towards the Western liberal democracies, Russia and its channels. One example, China might be another one. It's important to study the effects that the media from other countries can have on the recipients, and to think about potential consequences of sending Western sponsor messages, Western media towards the countries to perhaps promote democracies and liberal values there. And research such as mine, such as the studies conducted in former East Germany, in other communist contexts, show that there is some value in transmitting Western liberal democratic values to those countries, that they can make a difference.
Thanks for that overview. I think one thing I want to key in on there, beyond this body of research about how foreign media can really impact a country's domestic political circumstance, is the contrast that the two of you have drawn here between the longer term effects of the events you're talking about, where, Robert, you put it pretty succinctly, the effects in the 90s of those who are watching Finnish TV are pretty noticeable, and then they die out over the course of the next couple decades. And Isabel, in your case, a really traumatic event, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, brings back up to the fore all of these memories, whereas maybe they had been on the decline a bit before then, though certainly much more potent a deportation as opposed to foreign television. So we've got this interesting compare and contrast. Now, I'm hesitant to ask you to predict the future, but I'm going to anyway, which is, Robert, you've already hinted at it a bit. There's some more research that could be done about the impact of foreign media on recipients. Isabel, I'm curious to get your thoughts on where this leads down the road as the war continues, as this historical memory in the Estonian populace continues to, I think, probably never go away fully because of how important it is. Isabel, we'll start with you, and then Robert will come to you to close.
Thank you. And Ben, you really put it nicely. The sort of one of the key puzzles that research on historical legacies, which is the kind of research that we do, contend with, which is the issue of how long does a legacy last? In what ways does the past matter and when? On the one hand, you have some kind of events or quote unquote treatments, some kind of institutions, something like television, which may die out over time. You also have kind of events that become newly salient. And in one of the chapters I'm writing for my dissertation, I call these periods in which the past comes really to the fore, I call them sort of mnemonic opportunities, which might be a bit of a mouthful and kind of academic jargony, but I like it because it suggests that it's a mnemonic being a term related to memory. It's an opportunity for memories to resurface. And so I think that in certain periods of heightened conflict, periods in which people recognize a lot of similarities between past and present, that could be because the type of violence is similar. It could be because the quote unquote bad guy is the same. These are times in which we would expect the past to matter more. I think you could think of plenty of other examples as well throughout history. And so it's hard to predict the future. And I think political scientists are notoriously bad at this. I think that if we're talking about the long-term effects of the war in Ukraine, I think they will be felt for many generations to come, both in the Baltic states, where this sort of renewed threat of Russia has become even more salient, but also in Ukraine itself. If my study is any indication, if in the short term violence demobilizes people, at least in occupied territories, I mean, we're not seeing that in Ukraine today. But if in the short term this kind of violence has one effect, in the long term, I would predict that the people whose family members were targeted by Russia, which at this point is hard to even say who's been targeted and who hasn't, because it's just been so widespread, I think this will create a very long-lasting animosity that I think will further consolidate the Ukrainian nation and create a sort of wellspring of future mobilizational potential. So I know that's quite a mouthful, but what I want to convey is that I think Russia's attempts to demobilize Ukrainians will backfire. That would be my prediction.
It didn't work against the Estonians in the 1930s and 40s. It's not going to work against the Ukrainians in the long term. It's going to ultimately be a failure of Russian policy.
I think that's right. And I think they're going to continue to turn Ukrainians against them, which is what has happened since 2014, is that Russia's really shot itself in the foot with a lot of what it's been trying to do. There are ways to control politics in your neighboring country without invading that country. And I think Russia was doing a better job with that, quite frankly, if that was the goal. And now it's consolidated Ukrainian identity in a civic way, not a national way. So now Ukrainian identity is quite all-encompassing, and people who are not necessarily ethnically Ukrainian and don't even speak Ukrainian feel a stronger connection to Ukraine than they did before. And if that's not total failure of autocratic policy, then I don't know what is.
It's a good question. Robert, we'll turn to you, sort of the long-term view, as you close us out.
One thing that I wanted to say as we close is that some of those historical legacies tend to persist, perhaps because they are not effectively replaced by anything. But more like being deported or having a member of your family deported, then something that you cannot really, replace or erase. Whereas in case of like Finnish TV, liberal Estonia effectively got their own media. So all people in Estonia after independence, they could watch free media, American TV shows, Western TV shows, free use on the national media, on many Western TV channels. So effectively, they got something in your place. And so the effects that Finnish TV might have had before then, they were muted by the new institutions. So I think this is about like the historical legacies persist where the institutions that they set up, be it media, be it political systems, social relations, they persist. Once they're broken down, the effects also die out. One more thing, the mnemonic would think is that Isa found in her research are also something to be aware of in the context of people who might want to exploit them. Russian invasion activated so autonomously was this response that this resembles Estonia's Baltic experiences more generally in a negative way. No one needed to remind people that they had those experiences and they changed their mindset accordingly. But there are people, politicians on all sorts of platforms and in all sorts of countries that would like to exploit those opportunities, the painful memories in countries past to pitch one group against one another or one nation against another. And this is something to be aware of. History might live in the past and not be like inactive, but there might be people who want to try to activate it, sometimes for nefarious purposes. That's why I think it's important to study history, understand it, and promote the good version and critical understanding of it.
Absolutely. And I think that's a wonderful point to end on, because it's a call to action of sorts for those of us in academia to bring our research out to the rest of the world, for this academic insight to really help societies writ large. With that point, we will close here. Thank you so much, Isabel, Robert, for joining Baltic Ways. It's been a pleasure to have you, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Ben. And thank you, Robert, for a great discussion and great collaboration in the past and hopefully future as well. And I encourage everybody to take a look at both Robert's and my research. You can find us online, and we'd love to hear your feedback. If anyone reads our work and has a question or an email, feel free to get in touch. And again, thank you to AABS for supporting us so generously with our work. It would not be possible without you.
Indeed. Second to all of that, the support from AABS, both intellectual and more instrumental, has been key to completing many of the pieces in my PhD. So I'm very grateful for that. And I'm also very grateful for the discussion that we have had today.
It's been a pleasure for the association to support both of you, especially with the fantastic work that both of you are producing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Baltic Ways, a podcast from the Association for the Advancement of Baltic Studies, produced in partnership with the Baltic Initiative at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. A note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of AABS or FPRI. As Isabel said, please go find our interviewees and their respective work online. Thanks again for listening to Baltic Ways, and we'll catch you next time.